in a session about women and about one woman in particular who may have lived thousands and thousands of years ago. And in the audience, I can see many women and some men, and I can see some women from India or from Asia who may have some experience of what we are going to talk about. And there are many others who may know about Sita, but who may also be curious about women in India, because that it has been the subject of scrutiny recently around the world. Our session is about Sita, the earth goddess, and I will read out a little bit. I confess that my co-panelist Arshia and I have not even sat down to rehearse today how we are going to structure it. The reason being that we've done this before with different audiences, with very different results and very different reactions, and we just said we'll take it as it comes. And she thought I was moderating, and I thought she was moderating. And there we are. But I want to explain the background. I am a Hindu woman. As such, I am religious, unlike many people of my age or my generation. I do say my prayers, and I was brought up as a skeptical but practicing Hindu. And one of the things I was always skeptical about was the goddess Sita, because she seemed to me and to many of my generation a symbol of victimhood. And I felt that if the central figure to whom all Indian women are expected in some sense to relate, and not only Hindu women, because the image of Sita as an iconic image, it goes through to Muslim women, to Sikh women, to women of Dalit women, to women across Asia. Now, the Sita being held up as the model of virtue somewhere rankled, because Sita to me was the person to whom a great injustice had been done. Now, the basic story is that there is a goddess, she is abducted, a great war is fought over her, and then she returns and is then sent away on suspicion of her chastity. There's a short film which includes a little bit by Nina Paley, which is very popular on television. And this will give you a sense of what we are talking about. Then we'll take the conversation a little further on her books and my book. And then I think we'll open it out a little earlier, because I'd love to have your reactions or questions. So do you think we could have the film?
Yes.
So bits of that was from a film that we had as a chapter of my book, In Search of Sita, which also had a chapter, a leading chapter from my friend Arshia.
I wanted to give my version of Namita's introduction, which is what Sita is to me, and how I came to this story. I'm not Hindu, my family is not Hindu, but I grew up in India, and by the time I was 4 or 5 years old, I knew the Ramayana as well as I knew anything else. In fact, I perhaps knew it better than I knew most other things. And I remember also that my first memory of fear is from the Ramayana. I thought Ravana, the 10-headed demon, would come and take me away at night. So I thought I was Sita, there's no modesty involved here. So she's always been for me a story character. But there are obviously some story characters that jump out of the stories in which they are supposed to be contained, and Sita is certainly one of them. And as Namita says at the end of the film, Sita, the idea of Sita, has become a sort of dominant paradigm in this patriarchal culture in which we live for women's behavior, especially the behavior of married women. And there's also many of our, not simply our mythologies, but our proverbs and our idioms and our stories are all related or come out of the way Sita needs to exist as a married woman. And for some of us who call, who are late 20th century people, who are still proud to call ourselves feminists. That's a little bit hard to deal with if you're growing up in India and the paradigm is that you should listen to everything that your husband says and that you should be blamed for something that of which you were a victim, really. So, so anyway, I worked with Ramayana, with the Sanskrit text, and many years after I translated it, I wrote a book of essays about the text, and in that, I decided that for me, for the text to mean anything to me as an older woman, as an older feminist, I had to see Sita not as a goddess, but as a living, breathing human being. And so I read the Ramayana, the text in which he appears, as a love story, as a very tragic love story where a man and his wife, whom he loves dearly, are separated from each other. But what happens in that separation is that they lose their love for each other, yeah, because they change, and the separation changes them. So when Sita is asked to take her second test of chastity, to prove her chastity, in Rama's kingdom, when she comes back as queen, she doesn't look at him, she doesn't look at anybody. She's, in her mind, she says, Mother Earth, if I have been pure, take me away. Right? In the earlier trial by fire, she says, if I've been pure, give me back to Rama. Right? So the difference between the woman who says, if I've been pure, give me back, and the woman who says, if I've been pure, take me away, is huge. It's a lifetime. And then it suddenly occurred to me, this is not a victim. This is a very strong woman who says, I am not going to live this life that is not acceptable to me anymore. The man I married is now king. I don't know who he is. Even if I do know who he is, I don't like him that much. And she exits. Now that to me is a story of empowerment. And so when, the patriarchy, that thing, that one single thing called the patriarchy, when they say to me, oh, you should be like Sita, I'm like, yeah, thank you very much. That's exactly who I want to be. Because I'm going to go when it doesn't suit me. Yeah? And I think that's a very important message for younger Indian women to think about. And I mean, not that I want to be a preacher or anything like that, but it's important for us to understand that there are many ways to read old stories. There are many ways to make those old stories new or make them contemporary in ways that they speak to us. And sometimes it may be that we trap our figures of power within divinity. Yeah, that Sita being a goddess might be restricting her, and seeing her as a human being might actually be empowering her. So that's how I have come to think about Sita. And it's not like we think about Sita every day, but she's there. I mean, she is something against which we have to construct ourselves, and that's a sort of ongoing and very critical construction. Part of which is Namita's book called In Search of Sita. Now, why did you do the book, and why did you do it at the time that you did it? Because it's about 10 years old now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did it at a time when it was not the most convenient book to write, because it was a time when the traditional and patriarchal forces were being very assertive in India, as they are being now. And when I live in a joint family with my brother and my mother, and my brother looked at me with a sad face, and he said, why do you always have to do these sort of things? Somebody's going to come and burn our house down. But nobody burned our house down, because in fact, I got people from all sides of society to write about Sita, because I felt that there was something wrong in a society that was looking for gender justice, and which had as its main figure somebody who was so clearly, as we both discovered, not a victim, but who was portrayed as a victim. So I'm just going to read out a little paragraph from the beginning. Keep timing, please. Tell me when to. So, actually, I was driving back. I was on the jury for a prize, an international literary prize, and it was in Sri Lanka that this was being done. And I was driving from a place which is called, which was supposed to be the traditional place where Sita was abducted. And I thought I saw her. I have a you've just been to the Poetic Imagination session. I'm certain I could see Sita sitting there and crying. And so the search for Sita began near the botanical gardens in Peradeniya, Sri Lanka, on a day redolent with the breezes of spring. As I absorbed the lush landscape, the swaying palms, the feather-leaved bamboos, the Java willows, I thought I saw her sitting on a rock, perhaps an apparition from a Raja Ravi Verma painting. Raja Ravi Verma is the artist who, in a very popular style, has immortalized Indian gods so that everybody in India thinks that's what our gods and goddesses look like. Sita, Janaki, Bhaumi, Bhaumija, Bhukanya, daughter of the earth, because she was an earth goddess. For all of us Indian women carry some of her within us, Sita's strength and Sita's vulnerability. The name Sita derives from the Sanskrit word for furrow or marks of the plough, and metaphors of the earth surround her birth. Janaki, the daughter of Janak, was a strong young woman who could lift the har, which was Shiva's bow, with one arm while swabbing the floor with the other. Then why do I picture her weeping? When and why did she become a figure of weakness rather than strength? Sita, in our prevalent idiom, is weak, oppressed, a natural victim. Considering that Sri Rama's wife is an archetype for all Indian women, a role model pushed and perpetuated by a predominantly patriarchal society, it's no wonder she is somebody the modern emancipated consciousness prefers to banish into another exile. But she does not exit so easily. Sita has been there in the mass consciousness of our subcontinent for very long now. She is there in poetry, in song, in the tears that Indian women have been shedding through generations as they tread the Lakshman Rekha. The Lakshman Rekha is a line that was drawn around Sita, and she crossed it, and that was her sin. And the other thing where she lives on is the Agni Pariksha, because this is a country where we have dowry deaths by burning, and burning women is not considered barbaric, but almost sometimes not normal, but
Done.
So when I began this anthology, I got these pieces together just to question Sita. And what I discovered was exactly what Arshia said, that Sita was a figure of immense strength. And the second time, that rejection of all that she had been taught was her duty was actually assertion. And the book ends with I read this to make it clearer. At a moment of change, when some people are holding on to while others letting go of their past, I want to stress the continuity and the flexibility of Indian culture and traditions. Sita was not only an immortal daughter of the earth, but she was also intensely human, though her vulnerabilities are lost in myth and reverence. But Indian myth is never static. It is constantly in the process of reinterpreting, revalidating itself and the society it defines. So it's time to seek a new image of Sita, one who does not have to return to the earth, but one who can resolutely reclaim it. And that's exactly what is happening in India, because India is a society where we associate in the world press with rape and with atrocities against women, but it is actually a society of very strong and often very successful women who hold it together. And this book, in which Arshia had contributed one of the leading essays, was also led to about 8 more books on Sita coming out, and films and conversation. It's one of those things where myth has redefined itself respectfully, but with great authority.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, this is a sort of chicken and the egg thing, but our mythologies or our epics, certainly, they live with us in a very daily way, and we're retelling them constantly. There's Sam Arney, this young woman writer, she's I think in her very early 30s, she's written a book called The Missing Queen, and if you know the Sita story, you know Missing Queen means her, and it's entirely dystopic. Which I think is just wonderful, because the Ramayana, the text in which Sita lives, is a utopian text, it's an aspirational text, it's an idealized world, and this young woman is like, no, this is the worst world you could possibly live in if you treat your women like this. This is not a place that I want to live. And, so that is possible. And the reason, I think that the reason we keep telling the same stories over and over again, the Ramayana, we believe that the sort of the core of the story, or the earliest tellings of the Ramayana, are probably 2,500 years old, right? Now, either we're very persistent culture, yeah, that we just want, or that we want only one idea. I don't think it's that at all. I think we know that these stories are fundamentally problematic, and so we need to retell them over and over again until we iron out the creases. And who tells the story? That's the person who sees the crease, right? I can't tell the story to take out somebody else's crease. I have to take out the problem that I see. So the way I write about Sita is going to be very different from, say, a village folk song, which is equally subversive, perhaps more subversive than anything I could say would ever be. But we do think there are problems, yeah? And the central problem of the Ramayana is, why did he treat her like this? Yeah? So, in fact, the lens then turns away from Sita and onto Rama. And the last time we were having this conversation, I won't say where we were, because I don't want to start an international
It was not in India.
It was not in India. We were told that, don't say anything like patriarchy. And don't talk about the monarchy either.
In fact, they said don't use any word ending with an R.
Yeah. Fortunately, that session was only 20 minutes long. So we could just say, yes, Sita, but smile at each other and get it over with. But you cannot speak about
She
Sita.
is a very subversive figure.
She is a very subversive, and you cannot speak about her without pointing fingers directly at the patriarchal system that has constructed her in ways that are completely unfair to her, actually, and see her in ways that she doesn't have to be.
So one of the fascinating things is that the folk traditions and the classical traditions are completely in different directions. And even in this book, there are essays about the folk songs. And the folk songs side with Sita. They are of women singing and warning their women not to be like Sita. They are sung in marriages, they are sung in different situations. And so the same myth is interpreted as a living reality, of course, in different ways. And I wanted just to point out that the story has gone even into the future. There's a wonderful writer called Manjula Padmanabham who's written a novella about Sita in a future thing where the exile is to another planet. But the same story works itself out. So one of the things that Arshia and I were discussing was about how to explain to this audience. They are those of you who are of Indian origin don't need explanations, but how to explain the power of myth in India to an audience where your mythology is young. You've had myth come in from many other cultures, many other societies, and the Native American myths have continued, but there is no foundational or defining myth that never leaves its grip. A friend of mine who is an expert in Norse mythology and who taught it in Harvard, when she found out I was writing this book, she was horrified. She said, but that's in the past, you can't write about it in the future, in the present. But the gods are alive in India, myth is alive in India, these stories are alive, and we feel the power and the strength to retell them the way we want. And so I, in fact, would love to get, at some stage, if we have time, I'd love to ask questions of the audience of how they define or understand myth in their daily lives.
Should we do that now?
Yeah, let's do that.
I just want one comment. I want to say something about the American myth. I studied mythology in graduate school, and one of my teachers, Wendy Doniger, she said, of course there's an American myth, Superman, you know. Like, yeah, he's a superhero, he flies, he's like Hanuman, he rescues women, you know, his grip on our imagination
Batman.
is, yeah, Batman. Well, Batman is, more interesting. But,
I don't want to be so reductionist, but I was just trying to give you a sense of our side of it, and it would be nice to have an interactive conversation where we can keep feeding you and you keep feeding us ideas. So maybe
I can give you the microphone if you would like, and then people up there can hear you.
Can you add a few words?
Oops.
You
Hang
can
on.
turn it on, right?
We're just turning it up.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you say a few words how the males in India look and interpret Sita?
Can I
Please,
begin on that? You know, when my brother was saying, but they are going to burn our house down and all this, I had already asked a gentleman called Tarun Vijay to put in an essay in this book. And Tarun Vijay is a friend of mine and a very learned gentleman. And he was then the editor of the Panchajanya, which is the most traditional Hindu magazine. I didn't want to call it, they called it the organ in the Let's call it the magazine. For some reason, called the organ.
Occasionally, Namita.
But this magazine, and he, to my delight and surprise, being a man, being from a very traditional point of view, wrote the essay in this, which is the most sympathetic to Sita. And this one, who is described herself as a card-carrying communist, feminist Muslim, came out in defense of Rama. She said in the introduction, if you remember, she said, I go back, gaze returns to Rama every time. And it's so, the positions are not so easy as you might think. And in fact, if I can continue that in a slightly obscure way, we were doing a similar session. Arshia was not there. This Sita has been talked about in literally thousands of places around the world, and this was in Patna. And Patna in central India is the place near the place where Sita came from, Sita's hometown, Sita Mari. And one of the people on the panel with me was a man called, he's the Raja of Ayodhya. And Ayodhya is the place where Ram was the Raja of Ayodhya. And it became a street fight in the audience, not a street fight, a brawl, because the audience got up and said, how dare the Raja of Ayodhya come to Patna? You insulted our queen. See, so it's as though it's alive today. And it's not as though it's men and women or something like that always. The most disturbing thing is when modern day feminists or modern day women don't see the strength inherent in Sita as a figure who can nurture, be loyal, do her duty, and then reject, rather than just walk out of that whole set of situations. So it's not always men and women. Men, in fact, they are family. I was told that in Patna and in Bihar, where Sita came from, there used to be a tradition where every family had one male whose name had Sita in it. So it would be a man called Sita Ram or Janaki or something. So that is how strong the worship of Sita is among men. But sometimes for the wrong reasons.
I think also given that this is a generalization, I think Indian men look more at Rama than they do at Sita. In fact, at the end of this Ramayana, when they're back and they're supposed to be living happily ever after, he's reclaimed his kingdom, she's pregnant. Rama sends his, he says, what are the townspeople saying about me? And his informants say, well, it's not that nice. And he says, well, tell me anyway. And they say, look at this Rama. He's taken Sita back after she's lived in the house of another man. Now we are expected to do the same thing. And it's not possible for us because we're not as good as Rama is. Right? Which is a very complicated argument. I'm not sure that I can endorse it fully. But Rama is the ideal for Indian men. Right? And that ideal means you listen to your parents. Right? And if your wife is like not, she's making things uncomfortable for you, you can jettison her. But you must obey your parents and you must live for social honor and for private honor in social spaces. So that I think is a more dominant ideology than how do they think about Sita necessarily. And the two don't always match because you can have a sense of an ideal for yourself that is entirely for yourself and doesn't actually impinge on who's around
One
you.
of the most famous Indian laws is called Sita. It's called the Suppression of Immoral Traffic Act.
Very excellent.
There were some more questions.
I don't have a question, but I just want to talk
You
to
have a
everybody
comment,
about growing up in India.
We are adjusting it over here, it's on.
Okay. So growing up in
Could you
India,
Bring
give us
it
your name?
closer.
Bring it in, no, just a little closer to your mouth.
Yes.
Okay.
And your name, please?
Anjali, my name is Anjali, and growing up in India, as you pointed out, Sita was a figure we grew up in. But whenever my father would talk about Ramayana in particular, he always said, look at Ram. He fought it once, and in my eyes, he's just a mere man. Whereas Sita is the goddess.
Very
And
good.
that's what I remember about Sita.
Excellent.
Anirudh, do you want to run down and get it? Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Joyce Libra. I've taught Indian history here. I want to mention another aspect of the mythic construct of the feminine in India. There's also the concept of Shakti, which you might see personified in both the person and the myth of the Rani of Jhansi, and about whom I've written a couple of books. But in India, you see all over the country wall paintings of the Rani of Jhansi in battle against the British, together with scenes from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So she's ascended to the same realm, really, and she's a very powerful figure that Indian women can identify with today.
That's true. There are so many epic figures, both from the old epics and the new ones that are added onto them, who are very powerful. But the women in the Mahabharata, as compared to the women in the Ramayana, are extremely self-willed, always. And so when we were children, we were taught, read the Ramayana, don't read the Mahabharata, because they didn't want Indian women to get the wrong ideas. You're right that in fact, Hindu religion is perhaps the only religion in the world at the moment which has goddesses who are goddesses in their own right and not as consorts to men. I mean, any formal religion as this. And the Greeks have had 12 gods and goddesses, and one by one, Hestia, who was the goddess of the threshold, was moved out, and one by one, the pantheon moved to be an all-male pantheon. But in India, the worship of the goddesses is, and other people who are considered personifications of the goddess is very, and that's why it's paradoxically a land of strong women and men who wish that they were a little less strong.
And also very important that the powerful goddesses in India are virgins. Their powers come from their chastity and their celibacy, which is, I mean, that's as good as any feminist could want it. You know, they don't need the men. Yeah, but it's also true that, you know, and I think that's something that's a contradiction about India that's become almost a cliche. How can we have such strong feminine images in our stories and in our mythologies, and how is it that we treat our women so badly? And I don't have the answer to that. I mean, I
have the answer. It was not my answer, but it was the answer of a very dear friend called Javed Akhtar, who is a very famous poet. And it's a very famous interview where he says, beware of any culture where they tell you to treat the women as goddesses. We want women to be humans. Any society where women become goddesses, they are in trouble already. So, you know, when they say, you're an Indian woman, you're like a goddess,
that's when the alarm bell should ring.
I was wondering if Linda would like to say something, because I know she had written it. Okay. Any other questions around here?
Well, we have a question up in the overflow here. That's where the mic has wandered off.
Yeah, lovely.
So-
Could we have it? Sorry, there's the light.
Can the person just come forward so we can see them? Sure.
Yeah.
And there's a question.
Okay, Rashida.
Hello,
Bye.
my name is Shobha Rajgopal, and I've come all the way from Massachusetts to
Oh,
listen
thank
to
you.
your fabulous speakers today. I'm a professor of ethnic and gender studies there, and I found that the question that was asked about whether all men support this victimization of Sita, I found that question, I don't know who asked the question, I couldn't see that from there. Yeah. I found that a very important question, because even in India, as somebody else pointed out, there are a lot of men who do not support that at all. And if you recollect, even in the film that was shown, a little snippet from the film, You saw Lakshmana, who is Rama's brother, taking Sita to the forest where he has been instructed to abandon her. And he doesn't do it with any sense of joy. You see him weeping bitterly as he does so. And then there's something that we never are told, and I did not know it myself until I started rereading the Ramayana recently. Lakshmana later on is so consumed by guilt about what he has, that he has basically followed his brother's orders, his brother the king. He felt that he had no choice, that was his dharma. But he was so heartbroken that he beheads himself.
It depends which version you're reading, because you know, there are many versions of the Ramayana. So the one that I work with, he doesn't behead himself, but I think he commits a kind of suicide because he puts himself literally in the way of a rishi who says, if you interrupt Rama, the person who interrupts Rama will die, and Lakshmana is that person. So I think you're very right to point out that Lakshmana cannot, just like Sita, he cannot live with the man that Rama has become after Rama becomes king, and so yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for coming from Massachusetts, and I
Yeah.
hope you enjoy all the sessions.
Thank you so much.
Next question.
Thank you so much, Namita and Arshia. Like you, I grew up in India at a time when we had the Sita myth around us, even if we grew up in families which were liberal and were not really pushing that agenda down our throats. So my question really is, in today's aspirational India, young women under 30 increasingly living in cities, many of them on their own, sort of counterparts of who we were in college, is the Sita myth as powerful in their discourses, or has it waned a bit? I also like the fact that you connected that the Mahabharata women were not really held up for interrogation or for us to model ourselves on, because they're far more complex, what you do with a figure like Kunti and so on and so forth. So I think that's an extremely important point for foreign audiences, that we do have those two texts, but we were like, this is the text you look at. But is it the same way today for young women in Lucknow and Patna and Mumbai and wherever, living on their own and working? Is the Sita myth in their consciousness?
See, one of the things about Sita that came out in a lot of the reviews around this book is that Sita was the first single mother. And she brought up her children alone. And when the children were questioned, they said, Sita,
We are sons of Sita.
we are sons of Sita. In that line, they say her children Love and Kush are described by Valmiki in the matrilineal mode as Sita's sons. Maithili Sutao, Sita Putro. So there are a lot of single mothers around, and they feel that sense of this strong woman. They get the sense of a woman who could bring up her children and be independent. And she was forced into it, as many people are, and grew to that new strength. But my anxiety is that sort of brittle, aspirational modernity sometimes does away with the real strength of Sita, which is the real strength of Indian women, which is that they can handle a lot. She is, and that I'm not so sure. Maybe Arshia can tell.
I have a slightly different response about, I teach in a lot of different places, and I teach in very different environments. Not all of them are metropolitan environments where women, where the first language is English, where people come from relatively secure middle-class homes. Of course, I also teach there, and I teach Ramayana. It's beyond ironic that somebody like myself should become a missionary for the Ramayana. But it's the only thing people ever ask me to talk about. It's like, I can't really read anything else, or I can't review a different kind of book. Anyway, so the Ramayana thing goes on, and every time, Amina, every time I've spoken, I will be surrounded by young women at the end of the lecture saying, why are they doing like this to Sita? What do I do about this? How do I explain to my parents that this is not the way I want to be? So I think for people who live outside metropolitan environments, she's still, it's still a very, very big thing. But what is so exciting is that young women think it can be questioned, that they don't have to, just absorb it mildly or meekly, or yeah.
Does that answer your question, Meera?
Yes, and thank you for the gateways you opened with that scholarship to begin with.
We have time for one more question. Okay.
Hello, my name is Laura. I wanted to take this idea differently. I'm a Western pagan, so Sita is very important in our pantheon.
Yes.
Capital P crosses the world. My idea is maybe we should go back to the old idea of how the pagans actually did teach earlier on before the monotheists popped up. The idea was that we taught through we told these horrific stories, terrible things, and then at the end, the moral was, this is stupid, don't do this. And even the Bible does pick up on that. I think of Samson and Delilah, and I think there are a few other groups that kind of pull in that idea too. So maybe that's the whole idea too that we're looking at, that all of these stories are taking in the idea of they're showing you what a really silly, stupid thing these sorts of things are, and that maybe you should go do something else. Could that maybe take into the idea of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata as well as the Poetic Aida?
I find that very, it makes me very uncomfortable that, the stories that tell us what the stupid things are always stories in which women are violated in some way or humiliated, So that's not an explanation I'm going to take with any sense of comfort.
No, also in a simpler story, which is like a cautionary tale or something, that may be true. But what is even more disturbing is that Sita is hardly mentioned. She is the object, she is the trophy, she is the figure over whom wars are fought. But there was one of these essays mentioned how many times in the different parts she's actually mentioned. And she's an absent presence there. So I think that was not the case here. But then it became perhaps the case in the folk tales and in the folk songs.
Yeah. There's one very important thing in the Ramayana, which in Valmiki Ramayana, which people don't notice very often. It's one of the few times that Sita speaks as a human being, and not as a wife or as a sister-in-law or as a daughter or anything. In the forest, she tells Rama, she says, we're in the forest. This is where the sages live. This is where they practice meditation. Put down your weapons. If you carry weapons, you will draw violence to yourself. And she says, this is not a place of violence. And I thought that's just amazing that the one non-violent speech in the epic comes from a woman.
In the center of it.